On the 18th of April 2015, more than 700 children, women and men from Africa drowned in the worst tragedy of the migrant crisis. It was not the first such tragedy, nor the last, but it was one of the most horrific. The few survivors arrived in the dead of night at the port of Catania. In the days and weeks to follow, prosecutors opened an investigation into what happened, and the Italian government made the unprecedented decision to raise the boat from 370 meters underwater. It was a ship salvage like none other, with tools and lifting mechanisms custom built to lift the migrant boat from a remote, deep resting place in the middle of the Mediterranean. The migrant crisis has been an ongoing human tragedy for at least a decade. But after the Arab Spring of 2011, the sheer numbers of people attempting the dangerous crossing of the Sicilian Channel has exploded, as has the number of fatalities. On the 3rd of October 2013, 360 Africans died a few hundred meters from the coast of Lampedusa when their boat caught fire, causing it to capsize. The tragedy changed the course of Italian policy, with Navy and Coast Guard ships pushing out closer to the Libyan coastline to intercept the rickety boats and save lives, obliging civilian ships to change course to meet migrant boats in difficulty. On the night of 18th of April 2015, panicked passengers stampeded to one side on an overcrowded fishing boat, causing the vessel to tip over. Only 28 people survived, telling authorities there may have been up to 800 people packed onto the boat, many in the hull. It is this kind of dramatic and gruesome incident, like this scene filmed by the Italian Navy in May 2016, that sailors and rescuers have witnessed over and over again in the Mediterranean as the migrant crisis has worsened. The government ordered the boats salvaged from the bottom of the sea in order to identify the victims and further the investigation into the deadly human trafficking.
È stato un impegno notevole, però da una parte
it was a hard job, but I knew that it was doable, and on the other hand, I had the support of well-trained people.
Il supporto di personale
Professionally valid, I'd say, at the international level.
Di livello, direi, internazionale.
Sapevamo che cosa c'era dentro, sapevamo.
We knew what was inside it. We knew why it was on that seafloor. So it was also a satisfaction having gotten those people out of the dark and the cold, deep water.
The Italian government's approach to the Mediterranean humanitarian crisis has been to apply the law of the sea, whereby anyone in difficulty should be rescued. By pushing the Navy and search and rescue patrol ships out to the very edges of Libyan territorial waters, Italy and the EU's naval operations have saved hundreds of thousands of lives. The Italian Navy was tasked by the government also with raising the migrant ship. The complex salvage would involve finding a large offshore supply ship to use as a platform, to which a gantry would be bolted with strand jacks that could provide the pulling power for a customized robotic lifting module that would be lowered down to fit snugly around the sunken ship to bring it to the surface of the sea. Egidio Ibba was the project manager for the Italian diving and marine contractor Impresu, specialized in subsea work, and which was given the contract to raise the ship by the Italian Navy.
È stata fatta una gara per l'assegnazione di questo incarico.
There was a competition to assign this task, a task that involved the verification of the state of the wreck
Di tutte le informazioni al contorno
and of all the information surrounding it, so as to go on to study a method of recovery and carry out the operation clear to the delivery of the wreck with its cargo to the Italian authorities.
con il suo carico alle autorità italiane.
Based in the northern Italian city of Trento, the company Impresub operates mainly in the area of offshore hydrocarbon business to lay pipelines in trenches at the bottom of the sea. Building its own equipment, these dangerous and complex underwater endeavours are the backbone of Impresub's business. But the company's expertise has also been employed in judicial investigations. Impresub had crucial experience in salvaging a migrant vessel. Long before the migrant crisis of the 2000s shined a spotlight on the deadly crossings of the Mediterranean, there was the Albanian migrant crisis of the 1990s, triggered after the collapse of the Albanian economy.
Nel 1997
In 1997, at the request of the Brindisi prosecutor's office, we recovered the wreck of an Albanian motorboat, the Kater Primo Rades, that sank after a collision with the Italian Navy corvette Sibilla in the channel of Otranto, 800 meters deep. That was the recovery that probably still holds the record of depth for a whole wreck.
Probabilmente mantiene ancora il record di profondità per un relitto intero.
Thousands of Albanians fled to Italy. There were many incidents at sea, and there were 52 victims on the vessel that Impresub had been tasked to salvage. It was the deepest ship salvage on record in the Mediterranean.
Oltre alla profondità che impediva l'impiego di uomini in qualunque condizione, richiedeva il recupero del relitto
Apart from the depth that impeded the use of men in any case, it required the recovery of the whole wreck so that it could be investigated and the causes and the dynamics of the sinking verified, which is what we actually did, as well as having brought to the surface and giving to their families the bodies of 52 Albanian refugees that were trapped inside the motorboat.
Ai familiari le salme di 52 albanesi, profughi albanesi che erano rimasti intrappolati dentro la motovedetta.
Impresub's prior experience salvaging a migrant ship would be critical. This salvage operation was less deep, but involved many more victims and was located just off the coast of Libya, a lawless stretch of sea necessitating extra security measures. The tragic sinking of a migrant boat on the 18th of April 2015 led to an unprecedented decision by the Italian government to raise the ship from the bottom of the sea in international waters. The team that was chosen to raise it was all Italian.
Abbiamo individuato nella Fagioli di Reggio Emilia il partner ideale.
We identified in Fagioli of Reggio Emilia the ideal partner to supply a lifting system that was different and more suitable, safer than the system we used previously.
Più sicuro rispetto a quanto avevamo sperimentato in precedenza.
Per recuperare questo relitto avevamo già un'idea condivisa rapidamente con la Impresub.
To recover this wreck, we already had an idea that we had shared with Impresub, which was to use a stable ship, a large ship, onto which our standard equipment could be mounted so as to raise the wreck safely, and therefore we thought about a steel structure that supported the strand jacks that would actually carry and raise the wreck from the bottom of the sea. The strandjacks were the fundamental element, the muscle of the arm that recovered the wreck.
Il muscolo del braccio che ha raccolto il relitto.
Once the team had been selected, the project involved 3 phases, the first of which was to get an accurate picture of the ship's location and surroundings by doing a digital survey with cameras, robotic sensors and mapping software. The team tasked with the first inspection of the vessel left in October of 2015 to head to the migrant ship location, 76 nautical miles off Libya and 165 nautical miles from Sicily.
Uno degli aspetti determinanti.
One of the determining aspects that conditioned heavily the choice, over and above the location of the conditions, was also the, let's say, the lack of a precise drawing of the wreck to recover. The lack of a plan of what the ship looked like was one of the determining factors that conditioned our decision.
Recuperare.
Le operazioni di ispezione, quindi la prima fase
The inspection operation, the first phase of the project, was carried out in October 2015.
Abbiamo adottato per la prima volta una tecnica di fotogrammetria subacquea.
We adopted a photometrical underwater technique for the first time, which involved acquiring a number of reference points shown in images using very high-definition cameras.
Con telecamere ad altissima definizione. Tutto questo ovviamente poi è stato posto a confronto di altre informazioni provenienti.
That was then compared with other information coming from visual and sonar instruments, coming from beacons that we set up on the sea floor.
Sul fondo in prossimità del relitto.
La parte emersa dello scafo era abbastanza significativa.
The part of the ship that was above the sea floor was very large, and the hidden part was reconstructed based on the results of the photogrammetric images of the wreck. So we tried to interpolate the data that we had so that there were no holes, and there was a good level of agreement between the data.
Soluzione di continuità e ci fosse un buon livello di raccordo fra le parti.
The first survey provided engineers with critical images and parameters of the ship and an accurate map of the seafloor terrain, clues to potential obstacles, information that would be used to design and build a lifting system of the right shape and size. The team was able to determine the length, breadth and height of the ship, but also get an estimate of its weight.
La posizione dei 4 punti di sollevamento è stata vincolata da quelle che erano le dimensioni del relitto.
The positioning of the lifting points was determined by the size of the wreck, and what we had estimated was the area within which the center of gravity of the wreck would fall. We estimated that the load could be doubled compared to the weight we had estimated, due to dynamic movements.
Di tutto l'insieme.
The survey showed the state of the ghostly ship in detail. It was an opportunity to establish the state of the hull that would be under the greatest material stress during the lift. And, of course, the boat was full of hundreds of victims, whose dignity was to be preserved as far as possible during the lift.
Vedendo quei corpi, perché noi ovviamente che abbiamo effettuato l'operazione siamo stati.
Seeing those bodies, because obviously we who carried out the operation were exposed in close contact with the poor bodies, and having to work so closely with death day and night, for us obviously did not leave us indifferent. And the first sign we gave of this thought process was deposing a crown of flowers on the bridge of the fishing boat when we carried out the first survey of the ship in October.
Effettuammo la prima ispezione.
The second phase of the process involved accurately designing the tools to do the job. the lifting module that perfectly fitted the size of the hull. The boat was 22 meters long and 7 meters wide, and to fit snugly around it, the module would have to be 29 by 16.
Il modulo aveva una lunghezza di circa 30 metri.
The module was about 30 meters long and would be positioned transversal to the beam of the ship.
Posizionato trasversalmente rispetto alla nave. La larghezza del modulo era circa
The module was about 10 meters wide, so we had a space, a surface that was outboard, which was about 30 meters by 10, over and beyond the stern of the ship.
Al di là della linea di poppa della nave.
However, the added complication was that the size of the fishing boat required 4 long, extensible chocks to be installed on each side of the module. These would have to be hydraulically powered and so connected to a power supply. The engineers custom-made a system to connect the chocks to a power pack they had built using the power supply heart of the ROV. The tailor-made power pack was installed at the stern of the module. The lifting unit would be provided by Italy's foremost heavy lift company, Fagioli.
Ci sono dei cunei che meccanicamente vengono spinti all'interno di alcune sedi.
There are wedges that are placed inside the system that mechanically block each cable inside the steel structure. There can be many cables in proportion to the weight to be lifted, starting with a single strand of 15 tons and a maximum of 750 tons with 50 strands per strand jack.
Quindi minimo 15 tonnellate fino ad un massimo di 700 tonnellate con 50 strand per ogni singolo strand jack.
To increase the speed of construction, the lifting equipment was based on an existing structure that had been used to build the Venetian mobile tidal dam known as the Mosè. However, certain changes needed to be made to adapt the systems to fit the Migrant ship salvage specs.
Le soluzioni possibili che ci sono venute in mente a me e a tutto il nostro team.
We studied the possible solutions that came to my mind and the mind of the whole team, the ones that involved giving the ability to raise the wreck that was at 370 meters underwater in the fastest time possible and lowering to great depth steel cables 18 millimeters wide and with a load of 15 tons at a speed of 15 to 20 meters an hour.
Anche con delle velocità abbastanza sostenute nell'ordine dei 15-20 metri all'ora.
Finding a ship that could house 35 team members over and above the crew and provide the base platform for the salvage operation, plus be able to lift the wreck without ripping off the deck, was the next challenge. Again, Impresub searched for an Italian solution. The other essential parameter was dynamic stability. The ship had to be able to remain stable even in rough weather.
Questo è il sistema di grillage.
This is the grillage system that was used to redistribute the forces that were produced during the lifting process. Redistributing them over the ship deck, each individual beam was about 28 meters long. The beams were 1.5 meters high. The height from the ship's deck to the lifting point of the strand jacks was 9 meters. The length of each cable had to be 400 meters, each individual strand.
Ciascun cavo doveva essere di circa 400 metri, ogni singolo strand.
Si trattava di scegliere la piattaforma, ovvero il mezzo navale di supporto più idoneo a sostenere le attrezzature.
We had to choose the platform, so a suitable ship platform to hold all the equipment, house all the technical personnel over and beyond the crew that offered guarantees of stability on the sea in prohibitive conditions. And we identified the Ievoli ivory that, at that moment, was the best unit, to which we have to add the availability of a 100-ton compensated crane able to operate up to 2,000 meters.
Da 100 tonnellate compensata, in grado di operare fino a 2000 metri.
The Jevoli Ivory is an Italian offshore supply ship built in 2015 and weighing 4,693 tons. Now that it had been chosen and the general parameters of the module and lifting mechanism were established, work could begin on refining the project down to the last details. There were two problems that the gantry and strand jacks posed.
Le mare sono state, sì, molto complicate da disegnare perché siamo rimasti...
The chocks were very complicated to design because we were required that they not contribute too much to the overall dimensions of the module, so as not to have it interfere between our structure and Fagioli's.
La struttura è quella che Fagioli aveva creato. Appunto, essendo definito l'ingombro massimo,
once we had established the maximum dimensions when they were extended fully, they were not to have exceeded the internal profile of the frame, and this further complicated the mechanical design significantly.
Meccanica abbastanza significativa.
The module, once designed, was contracted to the Rossetti plant in Ravenna, known for their work on oil rigs the world over and for supplying the subsea platforms that the Costa Concordia rested on after it was righted in 2014. But this operation to raise the Migrant boat had its own set of challenges.
A causa delle dimensioni e la volontà anche di contenere al massimo I pesi.
Due to its dimensions and the need to limit weight, as well as the need to build a single structure all in one block that could not be rebuilt on location, we decided to build it close to the sea so it could be easy to transfer from the site to the ship. So this allowed us to have a speedy construction, as we were using the consolidated know-how of the naval shipyards that built the module.
Le competenze ormai consolidate all'interno del cantiere navale che ha proceduto alla costruzione.
Especially delicate were the places where the lifting cables and the module were connected. Unlike the 1997 wreck lift, this time the 4 strand jacks would be connected to 4 places on the module.
Questi qui sono gli strand jack, sono stati posizionati, come le dicevo, 4 strand jack.
These are the strand jacks. They have been positioned, as you can see, 4 strand jacks, and each one had cables, single strands, that were lowered, and these were attached to anchoring involving pad eyes, lifting eyes, and these housings were then attached to the recovery module.
Le stesse fixed anchor housing sono state poi alla fine attaccate al modulo di recupero.
Lowering the module to 370 meters below the surface would have taken an inordinate length of time.
Il sistema di sollevamento aveva 2
The lifting system involved 2 beams that mounted 4 double-strand jack systems.
Quindi 8 strand jack in tutto. Ciascuno di questi era in grado di sollevare 150 tonnellate.
8 strand jacks in all, each of which was able to lift 150 tons at a maximum speed of 20 meters per hour. The advantage of this system was to have 4 lifting points that allowed us to lift the wreck to the surface in a horizontal position.
Posizione orizzontale.
Furthermore, given the height of the Migrant boat, the superstructures would have to be removed before it was lifted to the surface completely, so as not to interfere with the gantry. The Italian Navy tested the project in January 2016, and the Italian Maritime Registry, RINA, green-lighted the operation shortly afterwards. The crew and recovery team mobilized on the 21st of March 2016, and the ship was prepared for over a month. They were ready to depart on the 20th of April, when they believed the weather would be stable enough to recover the boat. The Jevoli Ivory left Ravenna port on the 21st of April 2016 for the remote location close to the Libyan coastline, where the migrant ship that sank with 700 souls on board lay at 370 meters below the waves. The team tested the module at the bottom of the sea to check that all systems worked, and then the ship proceeded to the site.
Abbiamo fatto partire la mobilitazione, ovvero l'allestimento delle attrezzature sulla nave, subito dopo la...
We began mobilization, or preparation of equipment on the ship, after the first half of March. This activity of mobilization lasted a month, and then we took to the sea about the 20th of April from Ravenna, where we carried out the tests.
Da Ravenna, dove abbiamo completato questi anche i collaudi, ci sono dei...
There are checks and tests that can only be carried out at a full depth and not in the port. So, along the way, we stopped, and we carried out our checks and our fine-tuning.
Le nostre messe a punto.
Once on site, a new visual inspection showed that the boat's hull had not deteriorated since the first survey in October 2015. An independent ROV began working on removing the superstructures, cables and railings that might have become caught up in the lifting cables, and generally cleaning the area of debris. The weather did not promise an easy lift, but the Impresub and Fagioli teams got to work all the same. The ROV also used circular saws to slice through the hull of the boat to open holes to allow water to flow out freely, so that the strandjacks would not have to lift the weight of the ship plus the water it contained.
E la prima operazione in acqua è stata quella di procedere.
The first operation underwater was to go forward with a vehicle holding a mono-hydraulic saw that we used to cut the superstructures that would have stopped us from recovering the wreck, so we cut off the masts and the extruding structures, and this operation was carried out in not ideal sea conditions, but for this type of operation, this wasn't particularly important.
Di mare non ottimali, però per il tipo di operazione non erano vincolanti.
Fino a quel momento avevamo visto solo delle fotografie e qualche disegno.
Until then, we had only seen photographs and drawings. So when we arrived on location, we followed the descent of the ROV, and to see in real time the wreck left us all, I'd say, speechless at that moment.
Appena arrivati in luogo abbiamo posizionato un beacon.
When we arrived on the location, we positioned a beacon on the seafloor close to the wreck. The ship carried out all its tests, including dynamic positioning. We checked that all the signals were stable and constant.
E stabili.
Le lamiere del fasciame erano abbastanza...
The metal sheeting and the ribbing were quite deteriorated as far as the steel was concerned. But the fishing boat did not have structural breaks, apparently. And in fact, this was the case. Because if there had been any under the mud, we would never have been able to see them.
Se ci fossero state sotto il fango, non le avremmo potute evidentemente individuare.
La nave ha mantenuto la stessa posizione del tempo del Salvage di alcuni mesi precedenti.
The ship had kept its position that we had observed several months before. It was slightly listing to the left, but rested completely on the bottom and was in the sand bottom by about 50 to 60 centimeters. It was more or less horizontal, so in a favorable position for the recovery.
Una posizione favorevole per le operazioni di recupero.
The ship was accompanied by units of the Italian Navy that were on standby just in case there was an emergency of any kind and to provide logistical support.
Non va dimenticato al grande supporto e apporto che la Marina Militare stessa.
We should not forget the massive support and help that the Navy gave us, both in terms of logistics and in terms of safety, since we had to operate not very far from the Libyan coastline.
Non elevata dalle coste libiche.
Praticamente tutelavano il percorso delle nostre operazioni.
Practically, they protected the ongoing activities. There was already a wreck underneath us, and there was no saying that another might not happen there, and that would have stopped our operations and created delays and problems that had to be avoided at all costs.
Dovevamo escludere tutti i costi.
The crew and team waited for a window of 5 whole days of fine weather to ensure that the lift would work smoothly. With 20 hours for getting the module to the bottom of the sea and another 20 to get it up, the 5 whole days were deemed necessary for the operation to be successful. At last, on the 9th of May, the weather reports suggested a window of opportunity. Slowly, the module was lowered by the team, and at last the ROV could confirm that it lay at exactly the right place at the bottom of the sea. The module's hydraulic chocks were extended under the muddy surface of the seabed.
Abbiamo impiegato una ventina di ore per arrivare a...
It took about 20 hours to get the module to 400 meters below the surface, given that we had to carry out several checks on the way down to verify the system was working, and when we got to 350 to 360 meters deep, there was a further briefing on the following phases that we would have to follow to grab the vessel and begin the lift.
In the hours following the initial contact between module and the boat, the weather began to worsen.
Non avendo una visuale completa, perché sotto il relitto ovviamente non potevamo vedere che cosa era successo.
Since we didn't have a full view of the boat because we couldn't see under it and how the chocks had caught the boat, the detachment from the sea bottom was very slow, and we waited until visibility at the bottom was perfect to be able to check the whole structure and the wreck within the module before starting the lift.
E del relitto all'interno del modulo, prima di iniziare la risalita.
In the afternoon, there was a 50-knot wind, creating hazardous waves, with the ship pitching by 4 meters, making even the smallest operation difficult.
Noi che operiamo in questo settore la conosciamo bene perché è una zona di interesse e di attività di estrazione del petrolio.
We who operate in this sector know it well, because it is an area for oil extraction in the Sirte Gulf, and the sea, in the southern Mediterranean, is always at the center of poor weather and vortexes, where high and low pressure meet, that create permanent low pressure in a circular movement in that area. We know the area, the Sirte Gulf.
Questa bassa pressione in moto circolare in quell'area.
Al tempo non comanda nessuno e è arrivato.
No one can control the weather, and the wind gusts forced us to trigger an emergency procedure once it was halfway up. So in about 8 hours, we put the wreck back on the seafloor. They had to put the boat back down.
Riposato sul fondo.
Le condizioni meteo del mare e del vento sono peggiorate.
The weather on the surface got worse and kept on worsening drastically because we had personnel involved in outside activity on the beams, and the safety factor forced us in this emergency, forced us, let's say, to decide to stop the operation and reposition the wreck on the seafloor to wait for better conditions.
Sul fondale per poi aspettare insomma una condizione più favorevole.
A quel punto abbiamo recuperato il modulo in superficie.
At that point, we brought the module back to the surface with not a few problems. All went well, luckily, apart from the breakages that we would have to repair to be able to proceed with the operations.
Chiaramente riparare per poter procedere con l'operazione.
È ovvio che quando si parte con un'operazione e si arriva anche oltre la metà dell'operazione stessa.
Obviously, if you start an operation and reach more than halfway through it, having to interrupt it and go back to the beginning of the operation is not pleasant, both because we were working in difficult conditions with long shifts, day and night, and unfavorable environment. And when you're close to the end, having to go back to the beginning is frustrating. But our personnel and technicians are used to keeping calm and concentrating to reach the goal safely.
I nostri tecnici sono abituati a mantenere la calma e la concentrazione per raggiungere l'obiettivo in modo sicuro.
The Italian salvage workers, trying so hard to recover the migrant ship, began to wonder if perhaps the sea did not want to give up this watery tomb.
L'impressione da marinaio che avevamo a bordo in certi momenti un po' di preoccupazione, però
The impression we sailors had on board, we were worried. But with tenacity and determination, we all, no one excluded aboard, worked even harder and even more as a team to overcome this sensation that was growing.
Per riuscire a vincere questa sensazione che si andava maturando.
Effettivamente sembrava che questo relitto non volesse venire via.
It seemed that this wreck did not want to come away with us. We all wanted to succeed in this operation, so any small incident put everyone's nerves on edge because we all wanted to do it at last.
Insomma, perché volevamo effettivamente farcela, insomma.
The Ivory made its way back to the Sicilian port of Augusta, where repairs could take place. Weeks would go by before the ship and recovery system were ready again after the aborted mission to recover the migrant ship.
Ci abbiamo impiegato una ventina di giorni.
It took us 20-odd days as we had to wait for spars, we had to change strad jacks, we had to unravel the cables, organize special transports, and what with Sundays and so forth, it took a long time.
Il tutto si è trascinato in questi tempi.
Siamo rientrati appunto ad Augusta per fare
We returned to Augusta to carry out checks on the whole structure because after stresses they were subject to, we had to check the state of the cables after the continuous oscillations that they were subject to during the lifting process.
Che si sono verificate durante il primo stato di sollevamento. Beh, ovviamente anche le travi, perché essendo una struttura a sbalzo, ovviamente era dimensionata.
And obviously the beams as well. They were protruding from the ship, and although they were designed to be subject to those kinds of forces, for the greater safety of the project, we preferred to check them once more.
Del progetto, insomma, abbiamo preferito verificare di nuovo tutta la struttura.
On the 5th of June, the Jevoli Ivory took to the sea once again and headed for the wreck location where at last operations could begin anew.
Abbiamo fatto alcune modifiche per meglio garantirci da queste situazioni.
We made a few changes to protect us from the situation created by the high waves that were higher than those set by our safety limits. And then we took to the sea once more.
E poi abbiamo ripreso il mare.
Il meteo era fluttuante.
The weather was changing. It wasn't as though there was bad weather all the time. There was a month of bad weather, then 3 or 4 days of bad weather again. then 1.5 days of nice weather, then a fine day, and then it all started again. So we never had a window of good weather that allowed us to finish the operations.
At last, on the 26th of June 2016, the module could be lowered. The Migrant boat was captured and the system began lifting again.
Tutte le unità siamo in sollevamento col relitto dentro il modulo. Ottimo lavoro, andiamo avanti, grazie.
This time, the weather held long enough for the cleaning operations to take place at 12 meters depth, shallow enough for the divers to be able to access the boat freely, remove the bridge and protruding superstructures in order to raise the boat above the surface. Some remains of the victims were also removed.
Con successivi tentativi di intraprendere l'operazione interrotta spesso in fase iniziale.
With several attempts to restart an operation that had been stopped and started many times, we arrived at the 26th of June, when we finally managed to complete the recovery that lasted 4 to 5 consecutive days.
In forma continuativa.
Beh, allora il giorno del successo lo ricordo con...
The day of success, I remember with great satisfaction and great emotion because in any case, it was a very long period and we were at work for 3 months at this operation, and there were days that we all believed we could recover this vessel without difficulty. But then instead, there were days that were very difficult. There were days that it seemed that maybe it wasn't even possible to carry out this operation.
Che questa operazione quasi non si potesse fare.
Messo tutto in sicurezza, il tempo era buono, era previsto buono durare ancora un paio di giorni.
We had everything secured and the weather was good for several consecutive days, and we thought we were going to be able to carry it out tranquilly, but the weather was not favorable, and we had to secure again the vessel and navigate with difficult seas and at a speed of 0.1 knots.
Mare, perciò la navigazione di rientro è stata fatta circa a 0.1 nodo.
Anche durante il viaggio di ritorno, insomma, il maltempo non ci ha lasciato tregua, nel senso che noi
Even on the return voyage, the weather did not give us a break. In this trip, where we had the vessel attached, chained behind our ship, so we had this unusual cargo attached to our ship, also during the navigation. So the commander, for more safety, preferred to wait for a moment that was more favorable for navigation.
più favorevole per la navigazione.
Finally, the boat was lifted to the surface. At last, the remains of hundreds of victims trapped inside the boat's hull could be turned over to forensic analysts in Sicily and eventually given a dignified burial. The incredible salvage of the Migrant boat is testament to Italy's promise that these people's plight would not be forgotten, that the deadly voyage across the Mediterranean no longer remains hidden beneath the deep, dark waters in the Straits of Sicily. Ships can be salvaged. Lives cannot. Despite the heroic efforts of Italy's Coast Guard and Navy, the hopes and dreams of thousands of those who perished during similar voyages still lie buried at the bottom of the sea, after what was the most dangerous and deadly year on record for refugees and migrants attempting to cross the Mediterranean.